This is Owl Talk,
a Sigma Pi podcast
featuring stories,
news, updates, and more
from the world of Sigma Pi fraternity.
Welcome back to another episode of the Owl Talk podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about research. We're going to talk about data, and most importantly, we're going to talk about what that research says about fraternities, fraternity men, and the future of our industry. Today, I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Dawn Wiese to the podcast. Dr. Wiese has an incredible history as a researcher, an advocate, and a strategist for the fraternity experience. She currently serves as the Chief Operating Officer of FRMT, which is an insurance company that many fraternities get their insurance from. But more directly for this podcast, Dr. Wiese works with a wealth of data that is generated by the Foundation for Fraternal Excellence. For those who may not know, FFE supports both organizations and individuals who are working towards developing the next generation of fraternity and sorority leaders. That's Dr. Wiese's current positions, but our listeners should understand that she's received so many accolades for her fraternity advocacy and research. And those accolades come from all over the fraternal world, including Alpha Sigma Tau sororities, All-In Impact Award and their McCrory Award for Interfraternal Excellence, and also Sigma Nu's Regents Medallion of Merit, but also the NIC's Silver Medal, which is incredible. So I'm excited to talk about the critical work on behalf of the fraternity world that went into earning all of those awards and more. So Dr. Wiese, welcome to the Owl Talk podcast.
Thank you so much. It's funny to hear someone say those things about me, but I appreciate being here.
So this is interesting. I usually start these episodes by asking the guest to talk for a few minutes about their background and what brought them to Sigma Pi. Of course, you're not in Sigma Pi, but I'd love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about how you got to Virginia Tech and what brought you to Delta Delta Delta.
Well, so that's actually going to be an interesting story. You're not going to be anticipating this answer. Virginia Tech was very close to my home, about 10 miles from where I went to high school. I grew up in Florida before living in Virginia, and every plan was for me to go back to Florida. Both of my sisters had, and that was the plan. And then I started dating a guy who was a freshman at Virginia Tech when I was a senior in high school. And suddenly Virginia Tech looked like the place to be. And so that is, it's like, when you hear about those magical moments of how undergraduates pick their school, mine is a more embarrassing story to tell. At that time, Virginia Tech had a 3-to-1 male to female ratio.
Wow.
And I had my 3 boyfriends, just like the stats would suggest. So the one who brought me there is not the one who I had at the end. But I had a great experience at Virginia Tech. I loved it. So that's the Virginia Tech story. Tri Delta story, even more, will probably come of more of a surprise. And it's not something that I talk about much because it doesn't come up very much. So as an undergraduate, I was, again, not very far from home. Had a lot of friends when I ended up at Virginia Tech, and my roommate was a Theta, so I had a very active social life, and I was not Greek as an undergraduate.
Oh, wow.
I know. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, it's so not something I hide, just not something that gets talked about very much. And so had a great social life as sort of like a hanger-on. So started a career. So my career was in student affairs on campuses for 20 years.
Wow.
And fairly quickly in all of that, I was asked to join organizations, but at that point I was on the administrative side. And so I thought, I better not. I better, because it was always somebody who was sort of on the campuses where I was. And so it was after I left student affairs that I joined Tri Delta. So it wasn't until 12.
Interesting. Very interesting. We could have a separate conversation about that last point you made there, because in my work with not just my own campus, but around the country, you see that. You see a lot of administrators get asked to join the organizations, ostensibly because they've exhibited some sort of merit and the organization wants them as a member. But every once in a while, there's other motives. Sometimes in organizations like maybe we'll get them on our side when it comes to things. And what a great decision you made by waiting until you
Yeah.
were no longer in administration.
Well, and I would like to say that I was always on everybody's side.
Yes.
But I didn't want there to be the perception that I was on any one side more than another.
Yeah.
Yeah. Had it not, I'd probably be a Kappa Alpha Theta now. So, but I love being a Tri Delta, and my hair matches the brand, so we're good to go.
Great sorority. All right. I want to dig into this data. Maybe you can spend a minute or two doing a better job than I did a little while ago in explaining where the data that you work with comes from. What are the data sets? How far back does the research go? Looking at qualitative or quantitative, maybe you could let our listeners know, what are we talking about?
Sure. So, one of the things, so ultimately, before I left campus administration, and I do still have a foot in campus life, while the majority of my work is outside of campus life. I keep a foot in campus life. I still do teach at the university level,
Hmm.
just one class a year, one semester a year, because I love it. But if I could do more, I would. But the majority of my work now is outside. But when I was in administration, um, and ultimately as a vice president, there was a lot of pressure, and I felt undue pressure on Greeks to prove their worth.
Hmm.
And for me, I'm an all people matter kind of gal, and so I didn't see why a Greek student should have to prove his or her worth more than a non-Greek student from my perspective, but that wasn't the campus politics that I was facing. The campus politics, and we see it nationally, sort of an undue level of burden on Greek students to prove their worth. And so when something would go wrong so frequently, my phone would start ringing, and it'd be an alums and it would be undergraduates. And I'd, have all, the X group would say, we need to go to lunch. We need to tell you how great we are. We shouldn't be in trouble. And the starting point would always be, we give back more money to our alma maters.
Yeah.
And I said, I know that. I need more. I
Yeah.
need, because on the student affairs side of the equation, unless the president comes to me and says, don't do X, then a vice president has to follow the rules and regulations. And I needed a better argument than when we graduate, we're going to give back more. So I want to start that as preface, because I think that that's a key thing for both alums and students to understand, is understand your worth. And this is where I have a really fun time talking about the worth. So there had not been a lot of data supporting the fraternal, and I'm going to focus now more on fraternal because that's the
Sure.
area where I work.
Yeah.
There had not been a lot of data supporting the fraternal experience, and I think there's a pretty clear reason why. When students are in their doctoral programs, they're asked to identify a problem and study that problem. And whether it's a quantitative numbers project or a qualitative, let's look at. And so when identifying problems, it's pretty easy to say hazing is a problem, alcohol abuse is a problem, sexual assault is a problem. I will study that. And so there is a ton of literature about fraternity and hazing. When I say literature, I'm talking about sort of data and studies.
Yes.
Alcohol and fraternity, sexual assault and fraternity. And you don't have a lot of students, doctoral students, who then go into the field, right? You don't have a lot of doctoral students saying, I want to study how fraternities are great. And that was our problem, right? We were faced with a lot of studies that talked about how fraternities weren't great, but not a lot of peer-reviewed quantitative studies about why they are great. And that really is the genesis of the Foundation for Fraternal Excellence, which funds it, as you shared, but for that project to say, we need to start generating data that talk about the amazing experience that we know exists. The other side point of this, not just about advocacy on campuses, before I worked in the insurance realm, I was doing quite a bit of expert defense work. So for example, if Sigma Pi National Organization is sued, I might serve as the expert for the organization to defend the experience. And I needed, when I was in that role, better data to say, no, let me explain who fraternity men really are. And so those are the two important points. One, advocacy, and two, frankly, that litigation realm. And so through a number of conversations, that research project was born. It's now in I think it's in its 7th year.
Oh, wow.
Where we began to sort of first generate what are the kinds of questions that we want to ask, and then start cranking out the studies using faculty teams we ask the question. We don't ask because this is peer-reviewed work. We don't ask for a particular outcome. We'd like to see a particular outcome, but we don't ask for the particular outcome. We ask the question. And so what we're getting back is exactly the kind of stuff that one would think about the fraternal experience, which is really, really good news for the fraternal experience, because we know, and I can just go down the list from more likely to graduate to more likely to intervene in hazing. We've now got the quantitative data to back it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully we get into all of that here. I have to just give you my own little anecdote here. So you mentioned the undue burden on Greeks just to exist on some campuses. Reminded me of a very short story from when I was an undergraduate. I was president of my chapter, and the university set up some sort of luncheon with the campus leaders, student leaders, and the board of trustees. And I remember sitting down with these two members of the board of trustees. I don't remember who they were. It was me and the woman I was sitting with. The young woman was the president of Delta Phi Epsilon sorority on our campus. It was a great sorority on our campus. And we sat down, introduced ourselves, and the board of trustees members said, "Where are you from?" And we mentioned we were presidents of our organizations. And the very first comment was, "So you're in favor of the Greek life experience then?" And I went, "Oh man, we got to climb Everest here in the next 30 minutes."
That's right. That's right. Which is, I mean, you are hitting on exactly the point about why this is so important, and why, in my opinion, and I'll send this to you if I haven't already,
Sure.
why every fraternity man should have an elevator pitch. And so I will send that to you to make sure that you've got that. And if listeners would like that elevator pitch, they are welcome to use it.
Great, great. Well, so here's the big question. I actually want to split this into two separate questions, one focusing on undergraduates and one focusing on alumni. For the fraternity and the sorority alumni listening right now, and of course, we have a bunch of Sigma Pi alumni who listen to the podcast. That's our primary audience. What are some of the data-driven outcomes, some of the research-backed messages that you want them to know about the fraternity and the sorority experience?
So I am going to spend more time talking about the fraternity
Yeah,
experience, because it really, anything in the projects that I've been involved in, anything that we've done when it's also included the sorority experience is because our data came in that way.
yeah,
But our focus really has been fraternal. And so I'll just focus more on that. The sorority world also has its own research agenda, its
yeah.
own questions, but its questions are very different than the kinds of questions we ask on the men's side.
Very different organizations.
I contend that sororities and fraternities are actually completely different
Yes,
organizations.
yes, amen, amen.
And so they're asking questions that have more to do with marketing and extension,
Sure.
while we're asking questions about, wait a minute, don't tell us we're not bad. And I'm doing that from a defensive crouch, which is exactly what we need to move away from.
Yeah,
And I'll start there. So let me talk first about undergrads. So when undergrads are your scenario is a great one. They're faced with, wait a minute, you're pro-Greek life. Rather than moving into that defensive crouch, my hope for all fraternity men is, you bet I am, and let me tell you why. Whether we're talking about more likely to graduate, more likely to be involved in the classroom experience, more likely to have great relationships with faculty. The grades piece we have to be careful about, because there are some studies that say they have better grades, others that say they don't. So I always shy away from that. But if you ask me, I could produce that data as well. But then there's also data on the other side that says, no, they're probably the same. But even more important, because so often it has to do in the conduct realm, is a most recent study that was published last summer that suggests that fraternity men, and this is purely a fraternity study, are more likely to intervene in problematic areas of concern, from alcohol, sexual assault, hazing, all of these. To also referring students to counseling if they need it, intervening when they see a student going off track academically. In other words, what student affairs practitioners would call bystander intervention. We know that fraternity men are statistically more likely to intervene in these areas of concern than non-affiliated men. And we have that from a data perspective, statistical significance. We can show you the percentage point difference, and it's high between fraternity men and those not affiliated. And what do I think that is? I mean, it's brotherhood. Perhaps you're slightly pro hazing, and I'll say, and don't be, but perhaps you kind of like, because it's an insurance nightmare. But perhaps you're sort of little H hazing. I don't have a problem, with everybody having to wear ties on Friday. Let's just use that as a little H hazing, okay?
Like
Perhaps,
the sports teams do on campuses.
exactly. So perhaps you don't have a problem with that. The good news is that fraternity men, when they see problematic hazing, are more likely to step in, and we know it. We know that to be true. And for undergraduate men to embrace what that means is a big deal, because it means that when empowered with the information, they have that ability to differentiate when it's going in the wrong direction. It's powerful stuff.
It is. It is. It's interesting. Folks would, because everyone does this, they would assume the stereotype must be the opposite. It must be that the fraternity men are encouraging this and they're advocating for it. Meanwhile, you've got data that says otherwise.
Yeah, no, brotherhood is a real thing. And, I actually talk a lot with undergraduates about this. And I say, whether or not you care about the national organization, let's say an undergrad, because an undergrad feels so far removed, right? Let's say you don't care about the national organization. What you care about may be your brothers, and that's why you're sitting here. And if you know that you can protect your brother, and that fraternity men around the country are more likely to protect your brother, just follow that data. That is what you are naturally, we know this statistically, naturally attuned to do. So follow that data, protect your brother, and the line I always used to use as a vice president, just keep it between the lines.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, for the folks who are listening who are in that world, the student affairs world, student engagement, and I know we've got folks who listen. uh, If I were them, I wouldn't see this as adversarial data. Number one, it's just data. It says what it says. Number two, it's actually a victory for them. They've done so much training on things like bystander intervention. Take the W, take a victory lap. Be happy with this information.
Totally agree. And it's that beautiful partnership. I mean, this is when it works really well for our students, right? Is when for national organizations and student affairs professionals together work to support the experience and embrace that data and say, hey, this is a good thing. This is a good thing for all of us. And I'm going to give one more data point related to this because it's an important one that gets to your point. So it was in 2014. And the important thing to note, as I say that date, because now we're more than 10 years ago, we're replicating this study right now with even a larger data set. But in 2014, there was a study by a faculty member named Corprew, 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 who he was an anthropologist and was really concerned about fraternity men, right? Not coming from a Greek background at all. And he believed that fraternity men were more likely to demonstrate hypermasculine behaviors than those not affiliated. That was his hypothesis going into the study. And he was not able to prove his hypothesis and found opposite to be true, that fraternity men were less likely to experience hypermasculine behaviors. Hypermasculine behaviors also might be known as like toxic masculinity. That's the term you would hear. And this was such surprising news to many people. He was interviewed, and in an interview that he did with Inside Higher Education, which is kind of the daily newspaper for higher education, and Inside Higher Ed, he said something to the effect, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he said something to the effect of, something different is happening in fraternity. And it's something that higher ed should perhaps look into, because he was confounded by the whole thing. And to me, it's exactly what you point out. It's when student affairs and national organizations work in concert. And he mentioned, they get additional education, they get additional training than the average student. And perhaps that's a big part of it.
Yeah, some of the most well-trained students on campus, and that's incredible. So I wanna focus again on the second piece of this question, the undergraduate. So we've spoken to the alumni, we've got these great outcomes that alumni can embrace and they should talk about with their groups, particularly if they've got young people and their families who are going to college and are worried about the fraternity experience. You just gave some really great data on why maybe they shouldn't be as worried as the stereotypes might suggest. But let's talk to the undergraduates. We've got a bunch of young Sigma Pi men who listen to this podcast. What are the data-driven outcomes that maybe they can keep in mind in addition to what you said? What does the research say about their experience that maybe they aren't or they can't be aware of in the moment because they're living this undergraduate life right now?
So one of the things that you're going to see a lot of, and I'm glad that we're seeing more of this, because it's been an area that has been under supported, is the role of men in college. We know that women are going to college at a much higher rate than men, and that turn of more women than men in college happened somewhere between 1980 and 1986. So it's not new. Women have outnumbered men for a long time. And now, even at flagship institutions would be the university for the state. So even at flagship institutions in the South, where we have some of the greatest attendance at this point, women are more than 60% of the student population in many cases. So we no longer have parity of men to women in campus, yet many people are surprised by that, because you're still going to see women's support programs and things like that, when actually it's the opposite that's probably true on most campuses, is that what we need are male support programs. And fraternities remain, other than men's sports on campuses, fraternities remain the only place that are sort of a single sex, male only experience. And we know from corporate, because I just said it, that it's less likely to be an area with toxic masculinity than those not in fraternity. So we know we've got A, a support place, B, a place where it's less likely to be toxic, C, we know that so often what's happening with men's students right now is they are withdrawing. They are more likely to sit in their room. They're more likely to be behind a computer screen, more likely to be gaming, all of those things. And fraternities provide that place to kind of draw you out of that. So the idea that we need fraternity, I hate the what I would call a tired trope of now more than ever, but holy moly, now more than ever, we really need fraternity, because we are not seeing men enroll in college at the same degree. Likewise, we're beginning to see women outnumber men in the workforce. We flipped that just a couple of years ago. Now, I'm a woman. I'm not against women in college, and women working, right? And when we don't have parity, that's where we begin to have concerns. And we're seeing that in data about men with suicide, with jobs, with alcoholism. We're seeing that. So fraternity provides sort of that last bastion on college campuses to address some of those larger male concerns. So for the undergraduate student, I kind of brought it at the kind of that high level. At that low, at the campus level, people in fraternities, you're more likely to be retained after your first year. You're more likely to graduate. And important, so important for parents, right? When we're talking about the cost of higher education, more likely to have a support around you of other students saying, hey, you need to buck it up. You need to buckle down. You need to get into class. We have all of those data points from not only the classroom experience, but also that out of class experience and that level of support between brother to brother.
Yeah, there's so much there. We could do like a whole series of podcasts talking about this stuff, but it reminds me at the higher level for undergraduates. I talk to a lot of enrollment people, not just on my own campus, but around New Jersey, which is where I'm out of, and I forget the exact distribution. It's either when enrollment goes to 60% women and 40% men, or one gender or the other, or it might be 65-35. It's somewhere in that range. Once that happens, a couple of interesting things are born of that. Number one, the public perception of the university is more likely to be an all male or all female school. Number
Mhm.
one. Number two, related, once that public perception gets out there, the next generation of potential applicants are less likely to apply to your school because both men and women don't want to go to an all male or all female school.
Right.
So it seems like there's a crisis brewing there, and I wonder who in higher education is going to be the one that takes control of it and actually finds a way to maybe things will never be at parity, but at least try to get back to something that looks like it.
Right. I would encourage every listener to think about their institution and Google, fall 2025 male, female enrollment, class size, however you can kind of get at that data point and look at your institution. And that is point number one, why fraternity is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a larger follow-up question about the impact of the research. It's good to know this data. I think it makes our alumni more well-informed, our undergraduates more well-informed on the larger impact and the scope of the fraternity experience. For the undergraduates, like we just said, I think it makes them better on-the-ground advocates for themselves so that when the next stereotype is thrown their way, they can point to the data and say, well, actually, research says otherwise. But those are impacts at the individual level. Have you seen any impacts at the larger level, the institutional level for this data? That is, has this research made its way to the big decision makers on college campuses? And if so, are they using it?
I'm so happy you asked that question. So one of the things that irritates people in Greek life to no end is the idea that Greek students can't be Greek when they arrive on campus. They have what's called deferred recruitment, where they're unable to join until spring semester of a freshman year or fall semester of sophomore year. And a study that was published in, trying to get my year right, 2024. And again, I can give you that citation at the end of the meeting, and it's a part of this elevator pitch that I have.
Sure.
Tells us that the fraternal experience matters for that inside and outside the classroom experience on number of, from retention to more engaged in the classroom. That it is particularly true for first semester freshmen,
Wow.
which then negates the concept that deferred recruitment is a good thing. And, I actually worked on a campus that had deferred recruitment. And from an administrative perspective, I didn't like it because it meant that the students were informally rushing all fall, joining in January, and then not being initiated until midway through February. So 2/3 to 3/4 of their freshman year was actually caught up in the idea of joining a fraternity rather than just kind of coming in and doing it. So as an administrator, that's why I didn't really like it. But from a health perspective, what we know is that a student is more likely to stay all 4 of those years if he joins first semester freshman year. And it makes sense, right? You kind of find your people, you find that support system. And we know you find a positive support system, which is contrary to a lot of the things that people believe. And so I use that deferred recruitment analogy because we have been seeing since the research initiative began, we have seen school after school after school rolling back deferred recruitment
Wow.
and often citing our data. Now, they don't necessarily cite it by article, but we see in their letter to the community our material. I mean, they're literally quoting us without the quotes. And I'll direct you again, if you want to do a Google search, to when Southern Methodist University rolled back its deferred recruitment. There are pieces of their announcement to the community that are coming directly from it's Pike and Wiese, and it was my pleasure to be a part of that study. But it was the Pike and Wiese study of 2024, where they are citing our reasoning as the reason to reverse. So that's one example, and we're seeing school after school do that. A second example, there was a college administrator, college president, excuse me, in his opening convocation speech, when we saw citation of work we're generating, saying fraternity and sorority, join it. It's a great thing. And so we know we're making a difference, even if the quotation marks aren't around it. I don't think any of us need those quotation marks. What we want to see are thriving Greek communities.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I mean, that's exactly what we're hoping for in doing this research that the FFE does. So, Dr. Wiese, I'm a fraternity volunteer. I spent 8 years on our national board of directors, which is when I met you and other leaders in the fraternity and sorority industry. But I always tell people, and I mean this, the best volunteer job that I've ever had is at the local level. I became a chapter advisor over 20 years ago, and even through my time on our national board, I was still advising my guys locally at Monmouth University. That mentoring, that connection, I find it inspiring. I find it empowering. Is there anything in the data that you think an alumni volunteer like myself should know, or that we should be aware of here at the local level? In other words, while the data, of course, is not localized to my own campus, of course, when I'm advocating for my young men and really all the fraternity men on my campus, what are maybe 2 or 3 data points that you think would be best to keep at the top of my mind in my work?
So I'm gonna start with a concept, and then I'll go to the data points. The number one thing I would say is stop apologizing. We have nothing to apologize for. Now, if something goes wrong in a student population, none of us want to see high-risk behaviors and behaviors of concern. None of us want that. That is not the aim of fraternities or sororities, right? And so if we have a problem, the first place to go is not to say, "Oh, I'm really sorry," because that implication is we Greeks did something wrong. No, there's a problem that we share, right? That colleges and universities, these are college and university students first, and they've joined a member organization. So I want to start with stop apologizing. And when there's a problem, you work together on the problem. That's point one. But point two, and I want to go to your story that you shared at the beginning. Let's say there's not a problem. Let's just say, so you encounter someone and they say, "Oh, you're in a fraternity." Absolutely don't apologize for that. That is, you bet I am. Let me tell you how great it is. So if there is one point to take away, that's what I would ask that you take away, because we know, and here are those data points again, whether it is more likely to graduate or less likely. I didn't even talk about this, the mental health crisis. My gosh, less likely to experience depression and anxiety, and more likely to refer a brother to counseling. That's just yet another asset that I didn't even get to. That we know is the truth. And so know your data and be able to talk about it, because and when I say data, people are like, "Oh, data." No. This is life, right? Because what we've talked about is we've been able to descriptively say that all of these things are true about how great fraternity life is, and we have nothing to be ashamed of, and said we should be very proud. And then let me flip it to the alumni equation, because we've also studied that, because we know alumni are more likely to be thriving post-college. And so often in all of these conversations, people flip to, well, that's because these are people of privilege and that's why they're thriving, that it really has nothing to do with. No. And this is what's so awesome, is all of this has been controlled at every level in terms of socioeconomic variables, race variables, all of those things. So it doesn't matter. And again, controlled for type of institution. It doesn't matter if you went to teeny tiny college in Texas that no one's heard of, or you went to Princeton. If you're in a fraternity, you are more likely to be thriving as an adult than those who didn't go. These are the truths. These are the data, and they're undeniable.
Amen. Amen. I just have to take a little detour about your first point about stop apologizing. I endorse that entirely. When I ran for our national board, that was part of my platform. Like, hey guys, stop playing defense. I'm not saying you got to play offense. I'm saying you gotta at least respect yourself a little bit here. Don't apologize if you've done nothing wrong. And that was not always the case in many fraternities dating back decades. But it stands out to me, Dr. Wiese, because it reminds me again of when I was an undergraduate. Look, every once in a while, universities may make a hiccup, a little mistake here and there. I've never seen one apologize. I've never seen one apologize for their mistake. And look, higher education is a place to learn, and that's a great lesson for us to learn from them. We
Yeah.
have to stop apologizing.
Well, and I don't want to mistake that with when there is a tragedy. If
Yes.
there is a tragedy, uh, very, very sad, very, very difficult. And I've had to work
Awful.
some of those with parents when there are tragedies. But it's not the Greek organization that did something, right?
Yeah.
And so you work together on the problem. You can be sorry and sad about a situation, but it doesn't mean you're sorry to be a Sigma Pi.
Yeah. Yeah. The tragedies, of course, are separate issues, and I agree with you entirely. I think for our undergraduates who are listening, it's more the day-to-day attempt of some people in some places to take your values and use them as a battering ram against you. Like, well, you said you support this, but you got a noise complaint last weekend. Yes, yes, we did because we're college kids and we got a noise complaint. It's not the end of the world. We're going to pay the fee and we're going to be better neighbors. All right, that's it.
Yeah.
No apology. You just live in life.
Right. Well, and plenty of college students get noise
Yeah,
complaints. It,
right.
it's not like it is a Sigma Pi problem. Again, we have to differentiate between college student behaviors and the fact that that's the reality of being in college.
Amen. So I have another question, which is really the lead into, my next question to begin wrapping up. And it's an interesting one. It's, what else should we know? That is, which questions should we be asking locally? Which questions should we be asking as national organizations? What data do we need for the future? And by the way, just, as a heads up, my next question is going to be about future research projects. But what information should we be asking about?
So hey, I'm gonna go to hazing because I am concerned that we may be creating an environment that is creating more problematic hazing than less problematic hazing. So one of my mentors is a man named John McCardle. John McCardle, he was president of Middlebury. He was then president of Swanee. He's now retired. Remains a mentor of mine. I actually have a conversation with him later this afternoon. But John's a historian by nature, and as a historian, when he left Middlebury, he was asked the question, what are three things as a college president? And that he was asked by the New York Times. It was a New York Times op-ed. What are three things as a college president that you think college presidents really need to be tackling? And one of the things he said was the 18-year-old drinking age. And he said the 18-year-old drinking age doesn't work. You've got students who leave their homes, go to a place that has even less structure, and somehow there begins this expectation that colleges are going to be able to respond differently than would have been happening if those same students had stayed home, right? It's like, colleges aren't people's parents. And all of us know that the 18-year-old drinking age doesn't work. So John said that, but then the second thing he said was, if you look at historically over time, prohibition movements never work, and in fact will often drive to more aberrant behavior. And when that 18-year-old drinking age changed to 21, that's when the concept of binge drinking began.
Hmm.
And the trends just went up and up and up and up. And so I bring that up and some really wise information that I think John McArdle shared to think about what we're doing in these hazing conversations. And we already alluded to it a little bit when we talked about the idea that the entire basketball team can get dressed up on game day. But if a fraternity man puts on a tie on Fridays, that can now sometimes be considered hazing. That's problematic because what you're doing, first of all, you're creating a double standard, right? And that doesn't make sense on a college campus. It's not like people can't see that double standard. But secondly, when you make it so that everything is hazing, that's when behavior drives underground. And that's concerning. We don't want there to be, we don't want that concept of underground things becoming more dangerous, not being able to have actual conversation about where is the problematic behavior. The problematic behavior is not having matching clothes. We know what the problematic behavior is. And so I do think that we need to, as a nation, better understand the concept of rites of passage. And there are people who are beginning to study that. And in particular, rites of passage for men, which is even more important than the concept of rites of passage for women. There's a lot of data about this, mostly coming first out of anthropology. But I hope that we're going to spend more time studying that and thinking about that and stop trying to apply these double standards that are more likely creating problematic situations.
So that's what we need to look at from your perspective, and it's fascinating. I'm going to look into that myself as well. But I'm curious, what future research is already lined up? That is, what's coming up on the horizon when it comes to data on the fraternity experience?
A couple of things, and as I say this, the research agenda is only as informed as those who are in the field and providing us information of how about we look at this. So let me start with an invitation that if somebody thinks we need something studied, let's talk about that. We want to hear it. But one of the things, and I'll speak to that rites of passage piece, that is an area that we're beginning to look at, and I hope we'll continue to uncover that. We're also looking at the concept that hazing doesn't magically start in college. We know that it is actually starting at middle school, high school, and coming with students to college. And so understanding what's happening at that high school level and having high schools begin to educate and differentiate between behaviors of concern, those behaviors of concern, it is remarkable. And I saw this when I was a vice president, that we were able to trace hazing back. I was a vice president of a school in Virginia, and we were able to trace a particular hazing situation back to a particular high school in a northern suburb of Chicago, from that swim team to our swim team and those swimmers who joined a particular fraternity.
Wow.
And so we need to be thinking about these kinds of behaviors and how what's happening at that high school. And so that high school, the idea that behavior may be happening here and what's happening as they move to college, and how can we have those conversations earlier. Much like alcohol, colleges are not going to stop something that is being brought with students to college. I talked about the Corpus study, the hypermasculine behaviors. A replication of that study is currently also on the horizon. And I talked about mental health. The initial study that we did suggested that college students, we'd been in this kind of this serious mental health crisis, and we knew that fraternity men were less likely to experience depression and anxiety. We've actually seen a decline the last 3 years in those areas of mental health concerns. The national study is called the Healthy Mind Study, administered by the University of Michigan. But an overall, it's not University of Michigan students, it's just where the study is initiated, the data set's initiated. It's a data set of more than 60,000 participants nationwide. And these last 3 years, we've seen a drop off in rates that had just been going up and up and up and up my entire career. So
Wow.
we are actually running that study once again to see if indeed we're continuing to see fraternity men as actually your healthiest people on campus.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. This has all been incredible. Thank you for joining us today. Maybe the most loaded question, but do you have any final parting words, thoughts, some ideas for our listeners before we wrap
So
up?
the number one thing I would say is be proud you're a fraternity man, because fraternity men are not only the leaders on our campus, they're the leaders in our society, and our data tell us that. For those of you who are listeners who are fraternity folks, who may be higher education professionals as well, support your fraternity men. These are great men, and they need your support. They need your support because there aren't many people in their camp. And you've got the data to back up your support.
Awesome. If our listeners want to find more information on this research, where should they look?
So if you type in Foundation for Fraternal Excellence and men's research on fraternity, so Foundation for Fraternal Excellence, men's research on fraternity, you're going to find study after study after study. I will also send to you, Joe, the elevator pitch that I have, and I would welcome people to contact me as well. And I'm happy just to send you a PDF of that elevator pitch. I'll give you my personal email because that's the easiest one to remember. It's my name, but doctor in front of it. So Dr. Dawn Wiese, and Wiese is WIESE @gmail.com. If you say elevator pitch in your subject line, I'll send you a PDF.
Great. Dr. Wiese, thank you for being a guest on the Owl Talk podcast.
Golly, my pleasure. I love to be able to talk about it.
You can stay up to date on the latest in the world of Sigma Pi fraternity by following us across social media. We are at Sigma Pi, all one word, on Instagram, X, LinkedIn, and Facebook. On YouTube, we are at Sigma Pi fraternity, also one word. Remember, you can always get the latest information on Sigma Pi fraternity at sigmapi.org. Thank you to everyone who listened to this episode, and we look forward to you joining us for the next Owl Talk podcast.